Chapter 3. Finn's eyes wandered around the dining hall before settling on Arden at the opposite side of the table. His oldest friend stuffed his face with cardboard pizza. Soaked in red sauce, tomatoey drips fell from the slice and splattered the table. Finn stared at his own barely touched plate before pulling his phone from his pocket. Frustration washed over him as he checked all his unread messages. After giving Brynn his social media handles on Thursday night, not a single DM or request from her had come in, not even a clearly accidental like on a year-old post. "Bro," Arden said around another bite, "what the hell's with you?" "Nothing," he said, clicking his phone's lock button. "Sure," Arden said through a flippant smirk as he wiped sauce off his chin with his jacket sleeve. He cocked an eyebrow at Finn. "So, we've got calm in a couple hours." "Yeah," Finn said, taking a cold, unappetizing fry from his plate. "That girl'll be there," he said, and his voice reminded Finn of the way he'd teased Arden back in high school about Skylar. He winced at the thought. "Yeah," Finn said, grabbing another fry. "You were chatting her up at the bar the other night." "Yeah." "Skylar thinks you like her." Finn stopped chewing his ice-cold fries. "And she's always right about that kind of thing," Arden said. Finn's eyes met Arden's, which were too amused. "It's not like that," Finn said, his brow cocking. Arden huffed. "Then what is it like, man?" he said, snorting as he grabbed a piece of fried chicken from his plate. "'Cause from here, it looks exactly like that." "I hooked up with Mara at the bar," Finn said, glancing at one of the buffet tables behind Arden. "If I was into her, I wouldn't have fucked Mara right in front of her." "There's the Finn we all love," Arden said, grinning as he bit into the chicken. Finn shook his head, but his lips curved in response. "So then," Arden said, his mouth full with partially chewed breading and meat, "why are you so hung up on her?" Wine-red hair danced in his mind's eye, backdropped by fall's churning ocean tides. His fingers tightened into fists. "She seems cool," Finn said, shaking off the image. "I thought she could hang with us." "Really?" Arden asked, wiping his hands, all his plates finally empty. "Does she really fit the vibe?" Finn's brows converged over the bridge of his nose, a knot forming in his gut. "Does she really fit the vibe?" The words rattled in his head like a forgotten echo as Arden started stacking plates. When the realization hit, he scoffed. "I said that about Skylar back in junior year," Finn said. Arden chuckled as he stood with the plates. "Yeah, you did," he said. "Right, and Skylar's still here," Finn said, the knots unclenching in his stomach as he gathered his own nearly untouched plate. "Yeah, but that shit took forever," Arden said, heading for the trash cans. "And Skylar and I were a thing." "And?" Arden stacked all his dirty dishes on the conveyor belt that led to the kitchen. Finn followed behind. "I don't really know, man," Arden said as he checked his phone. "It's just different." As they headed for the dining hall exit, Finn felt itchy all over, like when he was a kid on vacation in the desert with his parents, and he'd fallen into an anthill. They blanketed his skin in an instant. The little bites they left behind itched for days. His sister, Rose, erupting with laughter whenever she looked at his red-pocked skin, didn't make it any better. More than once, he'd imagined blowing up the little anthill until the vacation ended. "I mean," Arden continued, swiping his screen as they walked, "she's even more different than Skylar, right?" "Maybe," Finn said, "but Skylar and those girls were always giggling and staring at us. It was fucking weird, you gotta admit." Arden elbowed his ribs, but that wasn't the source of the pang jackhammering through his chest. "Whatever," Arden said, pocketing his phone. "But that girl's always focusing in class and really stiff, you know? And I didn't even look twice at her until last week." "Yeah, same," Finn said as he spotted the house. Arden grunted. "Do whatever you want, man. You always do," Arden said, fiddling with his keys. "But just so you know, getting Skylar to work was fucking hell. If it hadn't been her..." He shook his head as he pushed the door open, but he never finished that sentence.
Brynn. Brynn entered Bryant Lecture Hall, unable to stop her gaze from snapping to the middle rows for a particular brunette. Dragging in a ragged breath, she unclenched her jaw and stretched it out as she took her seat in the back. It's too early for them to be here. It was the same thought she'd had on her way to class. Her stomach churning, her mouth dry. She couldn't help glancing every which way as she crossed the campus. She hated it. Sliding the strap of her bag off her shoulder, she dropped it into the always empty seat next to her. Then she dug for her crappy spiral notebook and a pencil. The only one she found did not jingle with any lead, and the eraser was worn down to the plastic end. She sighed, mentally calculating what money she could use to buy herself a new set. Just after settling on the fact that she could eat dry cereal for a couple of weeks, the hall erupted with sound. The bustling noise had been familiar since the first week of classes, but this was the first time it made her stiffen. Swallowing hard, she opened her notebook and busied her thoughts with reading through notes from last class. She didn't get far before 2 confident steps sauntered down her aisle. You know, when someone gives you their socials, generally the other person uses them. Brynn grasped at her next breath, staring at the brightly colored rainbow high tops Finn wore. Slowly, and with a rocky swallow, Brynn tipped her head up, her eyes meeting his. I don't really use any social media, she said, glancing at the door. Any? He asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Her gaze flew back to him, and when she saw his face match picture perfect to his tone, a chuckle rose from her throat. Immediately, she pursed her lips, bringing her right fist to cover her mouth. Looking off into the main aisle, though, she shook her head in answer to his question. I didn't even think that was possible, he said, shocking her with how amused he sounded. Yeah, she said. I don't really have a use for it. But she didn't want to say that. Well, Finn said, and it was so uncharacteristically clumsy that her gaze shot to him again. I thought you could come sit with us. Hands in the pockets of his baggy jeans, he pointed his chin to the spot where he and that group always sit. Oh, Brynn said, feeling the weight of her face falling. I'm, not really good with big groups. A flash of middle school beat at her skull. Faces shrouded in the shadows. Their eyes stalked her with pricking needles at the nape of her neck. She clenched her fingernails so forcefully into her palms that she nearly cried out in the big lecture hall. The pain brought her back, though, to this guy who looked so much like the ones that haunted her memories, and who also just wouldn't leave her alone. Right, he said, nodding to himself, glancing away. She knew the tone. He gets it now. She was different. He would leave, and that's for the best. Yeah, she said, as though a needle were stitching through her skin, her lips threaded into a taut smile. It's okay, she thought when their eyes met. Well, see you, he said, pivoting back toward the main aisle. She said, dropping her gaze back to her notebook. But the absence of his retreating steps lifted her gaze. He stood frozen at the last seat of the row. A full minute may have passed, she didn't know, before he glanced over his shoulder at her. The look in his eyes pushed her further into her seat, but he swung back around. Crossing in front of her, he stopped at the seat full of her things. Can I sit here? He asked, pointing to her bag. She gaped at him, her eyelids peeling back before she sucked in a breath. It's a free country, she said, moving her stuff. Letting out an airy laugh, he dropped into the now empty seat, but it stole all the air in her chest. Brynn pursed her lips and looked down at the well-worn notebook. as her heart raged like a wild animal under her ribs. What's going on? Why didn't he leave? What do I do? The questions fought in her head, vying for attention, but the chaos was starting to make the base of her skull throb. As the professor walked in, already rattling off announcements, Brynn focused every scraping breath on imagining all her muscles were clouds. It wasn't working. Hey. It was a low whisper that rustled stray strands of her hair. The shock of his breath so close to her face whipped her head around, even as she slid down her seat. He wasn't even looking at her. Head slightly tilted to his left shoulder, his eyes were focused ahead on the professor. Hysterical giggles gurgled up her throat, but she pushed them down. Can I borrow a piece of paper and a pen? One brow shot to her forehead. Seriously? She resisted the urge to sigh, holding in all the whiplashing sensations. It took a beat too long for her to rein it all in because his gaze slid to her, and his confused expression did her in. A gasp slipped out as one corner of her mouth turned up, the absurdity of this whole situation starting to sink in. But she reached into her bag and tried to find another writing utensil, hoping to find one of her generic ballpoint pens. When she found it, she set it on her desk and ripped out a piece of paper. Handing it to him, she caught a grin softening his face. She swallowed rocky air, but returned to her notes, trying with maximum effort to focus on the lecture. The professor had barely finished his next point when the paper, folded in half, returned to her desk. She glanced at him, but once again he faced forward. What the hell? She grabbed the paper, opening it, and found a messy scrawl of handwriting at the top of the page. The words ignored all the lines, which ignited a blaze of irritation. Every space on the paper is precious, but he'd likely never bought his own supplies. Would you be up for going to lunch? The words spelled out. What the hell does that mean? Images assaulted her brain of schoolyard notes she used to pass with her friends, back when she actually had those. Her fingers tightened around the pencil in her hand, and it moved across the page of its own accord, leaving a simple question behind. Are we in elementary school? She couldn't believe she actually wrote that, but she couldn't erase it with her whittled down eraser. Crossing it out seemed ridiculous. Obviously, he'd read it anyway. Could I just throw the paper away? That thought filled her stomach with pangs. Sighing, she simply folded the paper and set it on his desk. She dropped her gaze back to her notebook, but she didn't even see the page, couldn't hear the professor. When the ringing in her ears started, she realized she'd been holding her breath. She sucked in a jagged gulp of air as the paper slipped back onto her desk. When she opened it, she blinked a few times before processing the little drawing and single word written under it. Well, did he seriously draw an emoji? She glanced at him just in time for him to fling his head away, snickering. He did. Did she have to reply to this? An echo of salt water stung her tongue, her mind flying back to that day at the beach when his big, baggy coat concealed her tears. Her heart sank. She felt the weight of it somewhere near her solar plexus. She sighed again and wrote on the next line, "What do you mean?" Slowly, she folded the now well-worn paper and handed it back to him. As she waited for a reply, her thoughts wandered back to the ocean, to her sacrificed tears and the tide swallowing them up like they never even existed. She shook her head, clearing it all away. By the time she looked back to her desk, the paper was already sitting there. "I want to hang out. Just you and me," it read in his chaotic handwriting. Hang out? What? What does that? The room erupted in a cacophony of noise. Looking around, she found all the other students gathering their things. She glanced at Finn. "Well," he said, capturing her gaze in a vice grip. "You gonna answer?" Without the delay to process by passing the note, her jaw clamped up instead. He cocked one brow, but his expression softened. "I have the university meal plan," he said, and his voice reminded her of someone trying to soothe a wild animal. "We could eat at Crawford for free." "Finn," someone called from somewhere in the further rows. "I'm coming," he called back, glancing toward the source. "Okay," she said, expelling it from her throat like a puff of smoke. His eyes snapped to her, head whipping back around. "Tomorrow, do you have anything at 1? "No." "Then I'll see you then," he said, a grin sneaking out before he flew into the aisle. She stared at the spot he'd stood, clutching the strap of her bag, as her thoughts ran wild, trying to catch up with what just happened.
Finn. What the fuck am I doing, Finn thought. His chest was hollow, but scorching as his feet pushed him forward to where his things and friends were. They shot him confused glances. He ignored them, turning down the row just behind where they'd all sat. Leaning over the seats, he fished his bag out from where he'd left it. "Finn?" It was Skylar's voice. He glanced at her, but instead of the usual sassy expression she reserved for him, her brows were drawn. "What's up, dude?" Arden asked. "Yeah, bro," Avery called from the main aisle. "You hung up on some girl?" Kai, Soren, and Asher made whooping noises. He just laughed. "Nah, bro," he said, flashing a smirk at them. "I got stuck back there." "For real, dude?" Soren asked. "Truth," Finn said, bringing his fist to Soren's shoulder before passing him. Heading up the group, he made his way for the doors. Finn's gaze wandered to that back row, but Brynn was already gone. A sigh flew from his mouth, stealing the tightness in his shoulders with it. By the time they all left the lecture hall, Soren, Kai, Asher, Ender, and Elaine had pushed ahead of him, their conversation steeped deeply in replays of the university football game over the weekend. Finn slowed, falling back as Vera, Reese, Avery, Skylar, and Arden walked past him. "If you get bored," it was Mara's voice whispering in his ear, "DM me." Her bottom lip lightly brushed the flesh of his ear. Tilting his head, his eyes met hers. Holding his gaze for an extra second that sent blood rushing through his body, she smirked before pushing forward to join the boys in their football discussion. He didn't miss her involuntary glance at Vera, though. They all headed for the guy's house, but Finn's head swirled with the faint scent of bourbon. Soon, his thoughts wandered to Crawford Dining Hall. "Hey, you didn't really get stuck back there, did you?" Finn's eyes shifted to Skylar, who'd matched her pace to his. He glanced ahead to Arden. When their eyes met, Arden returned to the conversation with Vera, Reese, and Avery. His stomach churned, burning like the touch of vodka sliding down his throat. There was no accompanying buzz, though. Does she really fit the vibe? Those words had driven him back to that row at the start of class like a disturbed hornet's nest. "What makes you think that?" Finn asked, tucking his fists in his pockets. "Well," she said, "you like her, right?" "No," Finn said, nearly groaning. "Why does everyone keep asking?" "I'm just talking with her," he said. "Hanging out?" "Hanging out?" "Yeah," he said, bursts of air pressing the words out. "Like I hang with Reese, or Vera, or you." "You don't hang with us," Skylar said. His mouth twisted as his head whipped around, facing her, but there was no accusation in her expression. "What does that mean?" You don't, she said again. You hang around us. You don't really talk to us. Finn stared at her. A groan slipped through her lips, but one corner quirked up as she playfully rolled her eyes. Finn, she said, his name dropping like a sigh. You party with us, study, whatever, but you only talk to Arden and Avery. Finn groaned, glancing away from her piercing gaze. And now that girl too, she said. So what, Finn said, the words lashing out like little daggers that made Skylar flinch. It doesn't mean I want to do her. Oh, Finn, she said. You don't... Cutting herself off, a sly smile wove through her lips as she shook her head. What? He said, wishing to be anywhere but here, even as curiosity clouded his head. Never mind, she said, but if you ever do want to talk about it, you can talk to me too, you know? She didn't even wait for a response, shuffling ahead to join her boyfriend and the others. What a fucking pain.